Without any further ado, I'd like to bring today's program coordinator to the mic. Yes, please welcome John Belcher. Sorry,
Thank you, Eric. Eugene frequently shows up as on top places list, and two recent ones are directly related to today's program. Last October, Airbnb posted their top 20 locations to visit. Eugene was number 7 overall in the world and number 2 in the U.S., with a 213% increase in bookings between 2019 and 2020. In January 2017, Realtor.com also listed Eugene as their number 2. This time, it was the second most constrained housing market in the U.S. Is there a correlation between these two figures? That's one of the questions that makes this topic of short-term rentals one of high interest and high controversy, and why we bring this issue to you today. Let's start with some background. Short-term rentals, typically either AirBnB, VRBO, which is vacation rental by owner, and home to go, are becoming a popular way for folks to stay on vacations, place to stay on vacation, short business trips, or to temporarily relocate when they're moving to a new location. The same is true in Eugene, with many folks supplementing income by renting out a spare room or two, or even entire homes to guests. Short-term rentals also supplement the capacity of hotels and motels, especially during large events such as university sports events, and may be a crucial source of beds for over 50,000 participants, media, and visitors expected to come during the 2021 World Track and Field Championships. It's estimated that there are over 1,000 active short-term rentals in our community. Providers are currently required to pay 4.5% transient room tax for their guests to the city, but unlike most Oregon cities, there are few other requirements to operate short-term rentals. Some individuals have raised concerns that some hosts are inconsiderate neighbors, generating noise and parking problems for those who live near them. Others have raised concerns that short-term rentals remove capacity from long-term rental market, a resource already facing severe capacity issues, as I mentioned earlier. Responding to these concerns, Eugene City Council has formed an ad hoc committee to review the issue and make recommendations for changes in city policy. That committee is composed of owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied short-term rental operators, housing advocates, impacted neighbors, and special interest groups with a charge to report back recommendations to council before the 2020 spring break, which is coming up. Today, we are going to bring 4 knowledgeable individuals with different perspectives to discuss their experience and knowledge on the subject of short-term rentals in our community. First, we will hear from Catherine Dunn, who is a realtor and a member of the Eugene Short-Term Rentals Association. She's been a real estate investor for the past 20 years and owns many long-term rentals as well as 2 short-term rentals. She will describe the general market and benefits of short-term rentals to our community. Bruce Seal and his wife have been operating a very successful Airbnb for 4.5 years as an important part of their family income. Bruce is also involved in music production and portrait photography. He will speak to his experience operating his Airbnb. Dr. Rebecca Lewis is Associate Professor in Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. Her student, Sadie Dinatali, am I close? Published Assessing and Responding to Short-Term Rentals in Oregon, Enabling the Benefits of the Sharing Economy. Dr. Lewis will summarize what is known about the short-term rental market in Oregon and in Eugene specifically. And then JoJo Jensen is a professional voice talent, not necessarily a doctor, who records from her studio in the Laurel Hill Valley. She has been dealing with issues created by an adjacent Airbnb over the past 7 years, most recently having several Eugene police officers responding to behaviors during a weekend party a few weeks ago. So, this should be interesting. Let's begin with Ms. Dunn.
Okay, I gotta get my computer going here. Hold on. Okay. And near the microphone. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Dunn. Nice to talk to all of your bright, shiny faces today. A little bit more about me. Thank you for the nice introduction, but I do want to go a little bit further, just so you know a little bit more about who I am. Just so you know, why should you listen to me? Well, I'm a Eugene native. I'm also a University of Oregon graduate in the School of Journalism. I have a master's degree in human communication. I'm a realtor with the Carandy and Dunn team at Keller Williams Realty Eugene Springfield, and as John said, I am a real estate investor. I have 2 short-term rentals. They are both non-owner occupied in multifamily buildings. So one is in one unit of an apartment building, a 7-unit apartment building, and the other is on one side of a duplex. I also have 29 long-term rentals. That's my retirement plan, my rentals. I'm a member, as John mentioned, of the Eugene Short-Term Rentals Association. So as a realtor, what I want to do is start with property rights. I'll talk about that. The U.S. Constitution gives us all the right to own property, which includes all legitimate uses of that property. And that gives the property value. When government eliminates an owner's use, it takes away value, and this can be considered a regulatory taking, which the owner should be compensated for. I'm bringing this up because of non-owner occupied properties. People are wanting to ban them. The right of a use ends when it encroaches on others' property rights. The burden is on those who complain to show how the owner's use of that property takes something away that they own free and clear. So up to this time, no one has really shown that STRs, short-term rentals, are taking away anything that they own free and clear. So what are short-term rentals? These are properties that are rented for less than 30 days. They're furnished rooms or houses for guests with unique needs. They have multiple bedrooms, some of them do, kitchens, yards, laundry areas, garages, and these are great for families with children or pets, or they have special needs, including dietary restrictions with that kitchen. And they can select just the right location near family, friends, or their activities that they want to enjoy. They're affordable. There are STRs in every price category or budget. And the STR host qualifies guests and immaculately maintains a home to give guests a safe and enjoyable experience. And they want to also have an enjoyable experience too, the owner does, and they want the neighbors to have an enjoyable experience too. And that's why they qualify the guests very carefully. It's a top priority. Short-term rentals are a legal use of residential property in Eugene. We pay the same transit room tax that hotels do, 11.3%. 4.5% of that goes to Eugene. STRs are not hotels or bed and breakfast. We don't have restaurants. We're not a commercial building with 24-hour staff or the need for security because we have a lot of people in the building or extra safety measures. In fact, short-term rentals are exactly the same as a long-term rental, except for the length of stay. Now, some STRs can go back and forth between long-term rentals and short-term rentals. Like, for example, we might have somebody that comes to stay in our short-term rental for 30 days or more. An example would be traveling nurses or temporary employees that are working in Eugene. So they are used sometimes for long-term reasons and sometimes for short-term reasons. Short-term rentals are being unfairly criticized. Many Eugene citizens, the City Council, and the city's ad hoc committee are recommending regulations before they have even fully examined the facts. In fact, there haven't been very many facts even brought out. There are 3 common complaints we hear most often. STRs impact Eugene's housing shortage. There's a rise in STRs and out-of-area buyers are coming in, and they disturb neighborhood livability. It's wrong to consider regulations based on complaints but no facts. Complaints or opinions may not be reality. So let's take number one. Are STRs impacting housing in Eugene? Well, there are 70,469 total housing units. Of that, there are 33,600 long-term rentals and 841 short-term rentals, just 1.2% of all housing. Of the 841 short-term rentals, 337 of them are private rooms, and likely in an occupied house, and 460 are listed as entire homes. However, 38% of those were found to be very part-time, seasonal, or had 0 to 3 reviews in the year 2019. Now, this data about STRs was conducted by the Sisson Kovash Group, who are part of the Short-Term Rental Association, because this data doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere for Eugene proper. It does exist on AirDNA for greater Eugene area, and that number shows that 902 STRs are in the greater Eugene area. So 902, 841, it correlates. We're just looking at Eugene proper. So if we take that 38% of very part-time off of the 841, we get down to 285 rentable housing units. These could be long-term rentals if the owner decided they wanted to put them back on the market. That's 0.4% of our total housing. Now, I'm not on the city council, but if I were, I would look at that number of 285 short-term rentals, 0.4%, and I'd think, this doesn't look like it's impacting our housing shortage. So what is? Well, the City Council knows because in January 2019 they received a report from their staff entitled the Eugene Housing Tools Strategies Evaluation. And this report had one big clear recommendation, that the city should build lots more affordable housing, which means that rents need to be below $650 per month. That qualifies as affordable housing. And it recommended 3 ways to do that, 3 top ways. Build small multi-family units, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. They're less costly to build, so the rents can be lower. Remove the barriers to building ADUs. The city increased restrictions in 2014, and now, on average, we only permit 2 ADUs per year. Before that, it was 9. So we need to loosen these restrictions. And then consider implementing a construction excise tax. Short-term rentals, if they were put back on the housing market as long-term rentals, they would likely not rent below $650 because they're so fixed up. They're immaculate properties. Some might, but most of them would not. So another thing that this report found is that in Eugene, of all households, 51% are renters and 49% of homeowners, so half and half. 58% of those renters are rent burdened, and 36% are severely rent burdened. Rent burden means that they pay more than 30% of their income toward housing. On the other side, homeowners, similar percentage are mortgage burdened. So banning short-term rentals would financially impact all owners and help very few, if any, renters. So the city does need to loosen restrictions and build more housing. Now, of those 841 short-term rental hosts, who are we? Well, we're your neighbors. And we're educated, we're hardworking people, we're resourceful, and we're working toward financial freedom. Many of the short-term rental hosts need their property, they need help with their mortgages. Remember, part of us are actually mortgage burdened. We're attorneys, we're moms, we're artists, we're teachers, we're real estate agents, engineers, and retirees. In fact, retirees are the #1 fastest growing segment of short-term rental hosts in America, age 60 plus. We rely on short-term rentals to pay our mortgages, fund retirement, put kids through college, and work part-time in order to stay home with kids and volunteer in other parts of our lives for the City of Eugene. Are they significantly increasing? No, since 2016 they've stayed pretty stable. There was a little dip there when they weren't paying TRT taxes, but then it leveled out. So 2016 through 2019 it's pretty steady. 85% of owners live in Eugene, 82% of hosts have one short-term rental. So are short-term rentals affecting livability? We get common complaints. One, I don't know my neighbors. There's vacant houses in my neighborhood, parking issues, parties, noise. These complaints aren't exclusive to short-term rentals. This is life. Let's say there were no short-term rentals. Is this including his time too? Okay, that's what I'm doing. Let's say that there were no short-term rentals. None. Would we still have neighbors we don't know? Yes. Would there still be parking issues? Yeah. Would there still be vacant houses? Yes, there would. There's 2 in my neighborhood right now, and we don't even have a short-term rental. Would we still have parties or noise? We sure would when people have parties at their house. We have a party in our neighborhood every single week. More, actually, probably more, and we do not have short-term rentals. So these complaints are exclusive to short-term rentals. It's life. And Eugene already has police, parking, and noise ordinances. When life gets out of hand, we have somebody we can call. So let's focus on the benefits of short-term rentals. They produce additional tax revenues for Eugene. In 2019, our TRT taxes to Eugene was $352,706. It improves the appearances of our neighborhoods. Would you rather have a short-term rental that's immaculate or a long-term rental that dilapidates over time? And that is actually improving our home values to have our properties improved. They help residents and local businesses financially. We pay living wages to our housekeepers, our contractors, our landscapers, and more. We generate income for local businesses. We actually refer business to local establishments that we like spas and restaurants and retail establishments. We provide needed housing for Eugene's major events. What would they do without us? In fact, on the Eugene's own website about the 2021 World Games, the question is, where will visitors and athletes stay during the event? AirBnB is actually posted that we will be part of the housing solution. We don't have enough hotels. So to sum it up, any short-term rental regulations would be unduly burdensome because they shift the entire blame or burden of Eugene's housing and neighborhood complaints to a very small group of short-term rental owners who are just trying to get ahead. It simply isn't fair, it's not reasonable or legal. We propose that we work together to create solutions based on facts. We want to work with the neighborhoods, we want to work with the people who are complaining, we want to come up with solutions. We're your neighbors. But let's work on them with facts. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Bruce Searle. My wife and I have been Airbnb hosts for almost 5 years. I believe that someone stole some of my minutes, so I'm going to have to whirl through this as quickly as I can. Jennifer and I we're born and raised here. We were youth pastors, adult pastors, worship pastors, youth workers for all of our married lives. And we had kids in the school system at Churchill and volunteer at Churchill, and we still do today. Even though they're gone, we're still over there investing time and chaperoning trips and stuff. We care about people. We've cared so much about people that when we've had people that we've known that didn't have enough money to have their own apartment, their own place, their own house, we've let them come in and live with us, sometimes in 2 cases for 10 years at a time. And another case, there was a teenage boy that didn't have a place that was safe for him to live in. We were going to take him for a week, and it turned into 2, which then, of course, turned into 3 years. So it's not that we don't care about people. We care a lot about people. And yet we've always been kind of on the fringe of making ends meet under the poverty level and just barely making it. Airbnb has changed our lives. We took my dad's retirement, his inheritance, and I spent a year building, fixing up our little backyard cottage thing so that we could rent it on Airbnb. And we've finally been able to pay our bills. We've finally been able to give money to charity more than we've ever thought we could. We've finally been able to take our kids out to lunch or to dinner sometimes, or go to lunch or dinner ourselves sometimes, to be able to buy clothes for our kids. The difference between being an Airbnb host and not being an Airbnb host for us has been life and death. We would have lost our house by now had it not been for Airbnb. So you might say, well, what kind of neighborhood, do we have? Well, we've had over 1,750 bookings in our little cottage. It's one of the top wish-listed places to stay in Eugene. And we've had over 850 five-star reviews, where they're pretty much all 5 stars. We've had zero problems in our neighborhood. Our neighbors are happy. Our one neighbor says, if you ever need help cleaning because you got to be out of town, let me know, I'll come help clean. Our other neighbor is a policeman. He watches like a hawk, and he's armed. And he's good. He said, first I thought maybe this would be, but it's fine. This is fine. And so we want to be good neighbors. And I know that JoJo's going to share some horror stories, and my heart goes out to her. And I want to work with her and anybody to help, mitigate that. But what I do want to leave with is this, and I'm cutting out most of everything that I have to say for time, is that Airbnb allows us to finally be part of Eugene. And it's horrifyingly scary to think that the city might somehow take that away. It's meant everything for us. We don't have a retirement. We don't have a way to stay in our house if we don't make some income through, we do 6 different jobs already. And this allows us to do that. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me today. I'm Rebecca Lewis. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon and the co-director of research for the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement. Today I'm going to be talking about a study that I started a few years ago in 2017 with a student, Sadie, who since graduated, now works at Echo Northwest in Portland, and Bob Parker at our institute as well. The study was predominantly focused on small cities in Oregon, which does not include Eugene. But the findings of the study are relevant because we did a survey of the state to understand how other cities are addressing this. We have more of a picture of the data of what this looks like in other cities. A lot of them more vacation-oriented resort communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of what we found today across the state, and I want to center in on the regulatory approaches to talk a little bit about what other cities are doing to address this and some of the menu of options that exist. So as Catherine mentioned earlier, it's really hard to regulate something you don't have data about. And so the first thing we wanted to do in the study was understand what the prevalence and characteristics of these things are, because they differ a lot. There's a big difference between what you just heard about versus something that's owned by an out-of-state investor. The person never has lived in the property or seen it. And you can get a better sense of that when you start to dig into these data. So we wanted to understand the prevalence and characteristics of short-term rentals. We wanted to understand the revenue potential. So what are we talking about in terms of statewide revenue impacts? What are we talking about in terms of tax revenue for cities? At the time, it wasn't mandated that Airbnb collect revenue from all cities, and they weren't doing it. They're actually still not doing it. But at the time, we really wanted to understand what this could mean in terms of revenue. We also wanted to dig deeper into this question of constraint. It's a really difficult question to answer empirically, but I'll tell you how we approached it. And then finally, we did a survey of all cities in the state where we asked about perceptions from city staff. So what are you hearing from residents? What are you hearing from elected officials? What are you hearing from business owners? And what are you hearing from residents? To try to understand what's going on and to further understand how they're regulating. So I'm not going to talk too much about data sources. We used AirDNA, which Catherine mentioned earlier. It's imperfect, but it's one of the sort of most comprehensive sources that exists. I also want to point out that it's a lot easier to get data on Airbnb than it is to get data on all the other platforms, and there are many other platforms out there. So this is a snapshot, but it's not a comprehensive picture. We use some national level data from the American Community Survey, some data at the state level, and one of our data sources, as I've mentioned, is the survey that we conducted to planning directors and through the League of Oregon Cities website. We ended up getting about a 40% response rate across the state. That survey focused, as I mentioned, on perceptions, on the perceived positive and negative impacts of short-term rentals, and then centered in on these aspects of regulation. How are they defined? How are they regulated? How effective are those existing regulations? And are they intending to start regulating in the future? So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of portrait of what this looks like statewide. From the data that Catherine presented, it doesn't sound like it's very different in Eugene versus the rest of the state. So across the state, about 38% of rentals are entire home and rented more than 30 days a year. You can start to see that when you look at those that are rented more than 90 days a year, so ones that are sort of permanent Airbnbs, it's about 17% that are whole home and rented for this longer period of time. The reason I want to show you these data is that there's a lot of variation about what these units look like, and it's not the same for every single Airbnb. That's also clear in the revenue data. Most short-term rentals earn less than $10,000 in a given year, and 40% of all actually earn less than $600 a year. So there's a lot that are really posting their home for a couple weekends or a couple weeks a year. They're not doing this sort of on a sort of annual cycle, and that's important to understand as we think about what these things look like. Looking at some of the regional data, the main thing I want to point out from this slide is, again, omitting the 4 biggest cities in the state, Airbnbs are bringing in $82 million in revenue and have a sort of a huge tax potential both through the state levy and through the local levies. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things we were really interested in was how this might impact housing supply. It's a really difficult question to answer empirically, as I mentioned. So we looked at it 2 different ways. We looked at it a similar way to what Catherine presented earlier, where we looked at the percentage of total housing stock. We also compared what you could generate from an Airbnb versus what you can generate from a short-term rental to understand where are places where it pencils out more to put your home on Airbnb than it would to rent it long-term. And of all the cities in the state we looked at, there were 15 cities for which more than 5% of the housing stock is on one of these platforms. Those are mostly retirement communities, Bend, Manzanita, Seaside, Sisters, so on. And there are 7 cities for which the revenue you earn from a short-term rental on average exceeds the revenue you would earn from a long-term rental on average. So there's only a few places, again, in the state where this pencils out. One point I want to make is that we don't know whether these were always vacation rentals and they started using the Airbnb platform or whether they were new rentals. We did a little bit of deeper dive into that in the paper. I'm not going to talk a ton about that today. But our perception of this is you start to look at the percentage of the housing stock, you start to look at what the average income is, we can start to understand how this might impact housing affordability. I'm going to pivot now to talking about the perceptions of what we heard from the survey. So generally residents had mixed perceptions about short-term rentals. Some saw positive benefits and some saw negative. One thing I want to note is that in a lot of small rural towns, these were seen as really positive because they were seen as really expanding the tourism sector, offering somewhere for people to stay when they visit communities when there are no hotels. So in some places, they want to encourage and they want to facilitate these as much as possible. Other cities have a lot more issues, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Generally, elected officials and businesses saw these as less problematic based on our survey. The benefits that the respondents saw, generating tax revenue, supporting tourism, were the main ones. But the negative impacts the sort of complaints that were heard had to do with things like parking, had to do with things like noise complaints, and so on. And a pretty high share noted that they had heard complaints about these. Thanks. About half of the respondents noted that they had heard nuisance complaints in the last 5 years. So we also asked about regulations. These are generally referred to as transient rental or vacation rentals. They're generally defined as units that are rented less than 30 days. And about 35% of cities across the state are regulating for these. One interesting thing, again, we're looking at small cities. Some of these places have been regulating for these for 20 or 30 years because they're coastal communities and they were seeing impacts of these decades ago. So this is not something new that other cities haven't dealt with. This is something that other communities have lots of sort of experience dealing with. And really, like the City of Bandon, for example, has a really nuanced approach to addressing this. So most regulations are around permitting, and some of these are around taxation. Respondents also commonly regulate through concentration caps, limits, or occupancy requirements. So talking about what neighborhoods they're allowed in, limiting the number that are allowed on certain streets, those sorts of things are fairly common. Again, this is in Oregon and small cities. Short-term rentals were commonly enforced by issuances of administrative citations and fines. We also wanted to get at whether cities felt like they were effective at addressing short-term rentals. So the cities that are regulating generally see themselves as more effective than the cities that are not regulating. Most of them have no idea, particularly the ones that aren't regulating. But this is sort of interesting. Regulating helps you understand what the impacts are and helps you regulate for those. I'm not going to talk a ton about these different options. We detail this further in our report, but there's a vast menu of different types of options that exist in terms of regulation that go from something as simple as requiring registration for ones that are rented more than 10 days a year to really complicated approaches to thinking about caps and concentrations. So some of our policy recommendations, I'm going to have to wrap up so that I can let Jojo speak. Some of our policy recommendations get at the importance of legally defining this, codifying it with local ordinance, levying taxes which already exists in Eugene, and requiring registration. So I'm going to have to go through the conclusions fairly quickly, but the recommendations I want to make are it's important to collect and monitor data to be able to understand what's going on. Defining short-term rentals by ordinance helps regulate, and it's important for the community to decide what impacts are most concerning and regulate around that. There are a vast menu of options that exist that other cities have tried that we can learn from. So thank you for your time.
I'm Jojo Jensen, and I've lived next to a short-term rental for 7 years. And while Catherine and Rebecca talked about data, I'm going to talk about feelings. Don't groan. Specifically, I'm going to talk about what it feels like to live next to a full-time, non-owner occupied short-term rental. It feels unsafe. At 10:40 p.m. on January 11th, a Saturday night, I called the police about the short-term rental next door to me because a huge party was underway. Swarms of kids were already screaming and yelling, and cars clogged up the streets in our cul-de-sac. Within 20 minutes of calling, the cops were everywhere. Cop cars blocked the west end of Augusta Street, and they didn't let anybody leave, neighbors or partygoers. It was surprising that the police came so fast, and honestly, that they came at all. But the Eugene Police Department had a tip down from the Portland Police Bureau that bad actors were coming to town, and they were renting the short-term rental next to me. The police found guns, drugs, more than 60 people, along with known gang members who were involved with drug trafficking. The police still aren't commenting on this case because it's ongoing. This was serious business. And while, yes, this was an extreme situation, it was but the culmination of 7 years dealing with this short-term rental next door to me. So here's what it feels like to live next to a short-term rental every day for 7 years. It's hypervigilance, looking out my window when I hear a car door slam to see another unknown vehicle arrive next door? Will these people be noisy, drunk, high? Will these people tell me to mind my own business, only far less politely, or threaten me when I tell them to be quiet because I want to get some sleep? It's dread of every weekend, wondering whether this next batch of people are going to disrupt our quiet neighborhood. Drunk dudes after football games, or college kids who have now realized that they can rent an entire house to throw a party. It's shock when I go get my mail and the owner of the house yells at me to quit calling the city and complain, or he's going to sue me for ruining his business, even though he has never once taken responsibility for his actions. It's exhaustion. After guests disrupt life again and again, and the host does nothing. The owner was never around. He collected the money, but he never did a thing to stop the damage that people on his property were doing to our neighborhood. It's disbelief when a mother of a U of O graduate informs us that they'll continue to have the party for their kid as the night wears on. And when asked how she would feel if this happened in her neighborhood, she said, "This would never happen in my neighborhood." Seriously. It's terror. Wondering if the criminals fleeing from the Airbnb are going to break into your house and harm your kids. It's hopelessness. Feeling alone because the city council, and the police won't help. Compliance can only work with the codes that they already have. City council took far too long to even take an interest in this situation. And the police are understaffed, and noise complaints are understandably low on their list of priorities. It's powerlessness, knowing that the bad behavior of the guests next door will happen again tomorrow or the next day, and there's nothing I can do about it. One of the things I never felt was enriched by the steady stream of people coming into our neighborhood. They were only there for a place to stay, they're not interested in becoming part of our community. Frankly, the only people being enriched are those making money from the disintegration of our neighborhoods. Living next to a full-time, non-owner occupied short-term rental feels like we're losing the fabric of our neighborhood one thread at a time. Look, this isn't just about one bad STR owner. It's about how one house has changed our neighborhood. And even though the house next to me recently sold and my issue is finally resolved, I'm here now because I don't want this to happen to you or to anybody else in this city. And unless City Council creates some serious regulations regarding short-term rentals, I can tell you with 100% certainty that this will happen again, and maybe at a house near you. Thank you.
Okay, now it's question time, so I would ask our four speakers to come and sit at the tables here. Okay, yes, after the first question, right?
Well, that's up to you, yes.
Okay. So our first questioner, who's going to prime the pump for the rest of you members who would like to ask questions, is Rebecca Blankenship. Rebecca is a Eugene renter and an advocate for affordable housing. She's a mother of 7 children and holds a degree in political science, philosophy, and economics. She currently serves on that City of Eugene short-term rental ad hoc committee. So please welcome Rebecca and her question.
Hi folks, thanks so much for having me. My question is this. So we know that everybody who has a non-owner occupied short-term rental owns at least 2 houses. We know that we are in a housing crisis. Our homelessness is the highest per capita of any city in the United States, according to HUD's most recent numbers. We are in over 99% housing occupancy. In a 2018 interview, a spokesperson for Umbrella Properties stated that in any market where occupancy rates exceed 95%, that rent increases can be predictable on a long-term basis. We know that housing affordability is increasingly out of reach, both for renters who are just trying to stay housed and for people like me who are young and would one day like to own a house. So, Dr. Lewis, my question is for you. Is it a good economic trade-off to take entire units out of the rental market in exchange for private greed and profit?
Thanks for that. So I think that you raise a really important point. I think, again, it's really important to understand these non-owner occupied housing units that are rented more than 30 days in a year, where you know that someone is, they're basically what it's called in the academic literature, the hotelization of Airbnbs, that those are things that could impact our housing market because they could be taking units off the market. And so when we think about a regulatory approach, if our priority in Eugene is housing affordability, then that is the sort of issue that we need to be addressing.
Thank you, Doctor. Would any of the other speakers like to respond?
I will. First, in Eugene, the 85% or 82%, 85%, 82% I think it is, it's in the 80s, of owners in Eugene only have one short-term rental. So I'm going to correct that. And again, we only have 0.4% of our housing in short-term rentals. So I don't think that short-term rentals are actually what we need to be focusing on here. What we need to be focusing on is building new multifamily properties and building the housing that will have rents less than $650 per month. This is banning short-term rentals. These are not going to be rentals that rent for less than $650 a month. It's not going to do anything to really get where we want to get with the housing market. We need to do what we needed to do for decades, and that's build more housing.
Bruce, would you like to respond? Just introduce yourself again.
Bruce Searle. We don't have two houses. We have one house, and we have a little cottage out behind that is a grandmother cottage that we rent on Airbnb. And for us, if we were to put that on the long-term market, it would bring in about $1,500 a month, which is still well above what low-income housing could support. But for us, it's the difference of us actually keeping our house. So if we weren't able to make the income we make off of Airbnb, we would lose our house, and then we would be looking for short-term, low-income housing or living on the street. So it's not a greed thing for us. For my family, it's I got to feed my kids, I got to clothe my kids, and I've got to pay my bills on time. And this allows us to do it. So I think there's a full range of people that do Airbnb, and most of them, the majority of them, I mean, I was asked to speak not just because I cry easily, although I suspect that might have been, a thing, but because I feel this deep need to take care of my family, and this is a way I can do it. And I'm representative of all of the hosts here in town, who most of them are just trying to get by. We're not trying to, take from people. We're trying to serve people and make money while we're doing it so we can serve our families. Thanks.
Well, thank each of you for your answers and for your speeches. We're now going to take 5 minutes so that our members and guests who are with them can craft questions. So stay seated. More to come.
Say, Jim, you ready to go? Okay, welcome back to the March 6th, 2020 program, Short-Term Rentals, Good or Bad for Eugene. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our gold sponsors, Evan, Elner, Brown, and Schubert, Homes for Good, Gatos, Churnside, and Balthrop, attorneys at law, and our sapphire sponsor, AARP of Oregon. AARP of Oregon celebrates creating livable communities for all ages. Learn more at aarp.org/Oregon. Now, on to our first questioner.
Todd Boyle, First Decile Housing Group, and I want to thank the people who provided this data, which is much needed for the conversation. So here's my question. If you add capacity at the middle income level, housing capacity at middle rents, would that help the availability of housing further down? So we've been told by middle housing advocates, yes, we can build more middle housing, and then that will naturally generate more availability of housing down there at the $500 a month level. And then STR advocates we heard today said, no, it won't improve the situation for the bottom 20% of Eugene who are trying to live on less than $1,000 a month. It's 40,000 people. Thank you.
Would someone like to take that question? Is there a question?
Yeah, I asked a question. I asked if trickle down will help the poor people or whether it won't. Because we have a large community in Eugene who says that trickle down is happening if we build apartments.
Okay. Would anyone like to take that question?
I'm going to take a stab at it, but I'm making this up. So, yeah, I just want to be full disclosure here. It seems to me that, sure, that might help, but why not make more housing available at the level they can jump right into? And if you're doing housing at the middle level where it might trickle some down, then you're really devaluing some of those other properties. Why not just add more properties where people can afford them and allow other properties to be built too? I'm not sure that we want to limit what housing can be built for people that want housing. That's kind of seems like a no-brainer to me, but maybe it's harder than that.
So I should have mentioned earlier that Todd demonstrated our request, and that is ask your question within a minute, and if you don't, you get to hear the bell of shame, and we'll cut you off. So we have just a few minutes for many questions.
Hi, I'm Susan Conley. I've been a member since 2008. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. My question is for the realtor. So your charts that you put up indicated that, if I read them correctly, that the number of short-term rental housing units have been flat for several years in Eugene. If that's correct, my question is if your realtors and investor folks would be willing to accept a cap on those units at the number that we have now.
A cap. I think short-term rentals are self-regulating. I think that the more that come on the market, there's going to be more competition, and then our rents are going to go down, and that's going to cause some to not want to enter the market as a new short-term rental host, and for those existing ones, they may convert them back to long-term rentals. It's actually happening right now. We can feel when there's more short-term rentals on the market because we have to compete, and we're on our computers adjusting our prices all the time. So I think it is self-regulating. Another reason I think it's self-regulating is because this is hard work. Not everybody wants to do it. We have to make our houses completely immaculate. When we go in and clean a property every few days, we're cleaning the whole place, washing every single towel, plate. I mean, it's really a major job, and not everybody's going to want to do that. So I don't think that it's going to really increase that much. Just because people think that it's going to be a lot of money. And then one last thing, the real property investor who invests in long-term rentals, they want passive income. They're going to stay in the long-term rental market. This is not passive income.
Can I just make a quick one?
Quickly, please.
I just want to say, though, that as far as prices go, and y'all short-term rental people adjust your prices, part of the problem with the house next to me, an entire house was rented from $43 a night to $200 a night. And guess what happened? College students found that they could rent an entire house for $72 and throw a party. This is a real problem.
Bob Cassidy, City Club member. That was fascinating information about short-term rentals in Eugene, and small cities were mentioned, but our neighboring city, Glenwood and Springfield, was not considered, not information at all. Could we have some of that information, or is there a value in that?
Springfield is in our study. I can follow up with you with some of those data. I don't have them on hand today.
Mary Layton, a City Club member since 2006, I think, and this is a question from Tim Morris, who says, there's not currently a renter advocate to speak about short-term rentals in a city that's 51% renters. And he wants to know, why there seems to be discrepancy in the data characterizing the market and the marketplace among you. Did you hear a discrepancy, and do you just report it differently?
So may I remind everybody to introduce themselves each time they speak?
Oh,
Thank you.
This is Rebecca Lewis. I think our data was fairly consistent. I'm looking statewide, and Catherine's data was looking just to the City of Eugene, but there was pretty strong consistency in terms of the share of the overall housing market, and as well as the percentage of owner-occupied units. I'm trying to think. Most of them were fairly consistent, I would say.
So yeah, mainly it was they're different smaller cities versus our city in particular, which is what we would be more interested in, and that the percentage across the state, which is, you're looking at also at more vacation travel spot, places like the coast and Yachats and all these places you can rent cabins. Whereas they're about 5% or 6% or 4% of the places there are a short-term stay. Here it's like less than 1%. So we have a much lower, that's why that discrepancy looks different, because we're looking at two different types of cities and two different types of travel patterns and stuff too. And I mentioned this is totally anecdotal and not true. Again, here I am. We can't rent, I don't think, any cabins over at the coast anymore unless we go through STROs to get them. So I think a lot of them have migrated over to that platform.
Thank you. Sandra Bishop, longtime City Club member from the beginning. So I'm asking a question on behalf of some folks who are not they're not yet members of City Club. So regulations of some kind are definitely needed for short-term rentals. We all hope that they're going to be based on facts and figures and not some irrational emotions, as some of the small cities have adopted ordinances that really are not working very well. What would those of you that are kind of on opposite sides of this or looking at different views of it, would you support using the existing STR taxes that come to the city? Would you support pushing the city to put that into some sort of a category where it's used to build the lower income housing? And then the question is, can you really build low income housing at $650 a month? It costs more to build than you can get out of it. So that was part of their question. But the main question is, would you put that into a housing fund, the existing?
Catherine, introduce yourself.
Catherine
please.
Dunn. We definitely have talked about that in our association about having the transit tax go to short-term housing, but it's the state constitution that would need to be changed in order to do that. But I would fully support that. I don't think that short-term rentals were really around, when that was put into place. So maybe that would be a good reason to revisit it. So that's.
Bruce Searle again, making stuff up on the fly. I think in order to make that work, thank you. You guys switching it up for me. In order to make that work, one of the things that the city would have to do is they would have to say, we want short-term, we want lower income housing built, and so we're going to waive some of the exorbitant permitting fees that make some of these properties so ridiculously high. I mean, if you build a house now, you might as well not build a house because the fees are so high. It's so crazy. So that would help. The city would actually have to get behind making it so we could build more and making so it's affordable also. But I, as an Airbnb-er, I'm totally for taking the revenue that comes in. I mean, we're a successful Airbnb, very successful. We're super blessed by that. And we've paid thousands of dollars into the taxes here. Happy. Great. We've never been able to do that before. That kind of makes me happy, but in a sad sort of way. But I'd love to see that go to things that I also would love to see happen, which is lower income housing.
So we have 5 minutes left.
I just want to say one more thing. Jojo Jensen, and as the Bluebird of Happiness here, I just want to say, what is to stop people that build new housing units from deciding that they can make more money as a short-term rental? Just a question.
I'm Emily Semple, member of City Club since 2016. Somebody in my group pointed out that the impacts of empty STRs is not just affecting next-door neighbors, but the entire neighborhood. Empty houses, not much of a neighborhood. As a city councilor, I'm interested in what regulations are used in other cities and what you would suggest specifically for Eugene to use to decrease the effects of STRs on neighborhoods. Thank you.
So I want to take that question and go back a little bit to Rebecca's question.
Rebecca.
This is Rebecca Lewis again from the University of Oregon. So I think that, you're hearing stories about sort of the impacts of these on someone's individual household, and there are ways to sort of disincentivize the ones that we think are causing problems and incentivize the ones we want to encourage. And so some other cities have done tiered fees where the non-owner occupied ones pay higher fees than the ones that are owner occupied. Cities like Portland allow you to rent out a unit like Bruce's anytime, but to rent out your entire home, you're limited to 90 days a year. It's a little difficult to enforce, but there are ways to address some of these things through regulations, either through tiering of fees or through thinking about owner occupancy requirements or limits on the number of days that it's rented per year. So
I wonder. Catherine Den, limiting long-term or short-term rental properties to 90 days a year if they're non-owner occupied would in effect ban them. Because these are fully furnished properties. What are we going to do? Just let it sit there? We can't do that. We would have to go back to long-term rentals. And again, this is taking value away from us. If we believe that this is what we want to do with our property, we should have the right to do it. We have property rights. So we would not want to have the 90 days or less regulation.
Sorry, Jojo Jensen, Bluebird of Happiness again. I just want to state, though, that there is no neighborhood without neighbors.
Okay. No, we're going to go to our last question. Sorry, we're just short on time.
Okay, my name's Paul Thompson. I've been a City Club member on and off for about a decade or so. Anyway, this is a question for JoJo, but other people can chime in if they'd like to. So let's pretend that you were a benevolent dictator. And you had the opportunity to institute one regulation which not only solves your problem, but is fair for the property owners and across. Just one of them.
Well, Jojo Jensen is your benevolent dictator. Of happiness, right. Talking to other people that have been impacted by short-term rentals, including myself, which is also my entire neighborhood. It's not just me being a big fat whiner. So in my benevolent dictatorship, the easiest way for us to solve the problems like the one that we faced in my neighborhood is to just not allow full-time, non-owner occupied short-term rentals. You can call them whatever you want, but this is still a hotel in the middle of my neighborhood next door. It's people coming and going at all hours. It's people not giving a crap about my neighborhood. They're just staying there for a couple of days. What do they care if they throw a party and wreak havoc? They're going back home. As the lady said, this would never happen in my neighborhood.
This is Catherine Dunn. We have a few bad actors. In any neighborhood, we can have a bad actor. We can have a bad neighbor. Just because there are some, and we don't agree with that, we think that they should have fines or something. We want to work with them to understand what they can do to regulate that. But it's not, the answer is not to take a few bad apples and regulate all of short-term rentals that are non-owner occupied. It's just not fair. We need to try something else.
Okay.